Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboy Time Story, we ride the stories of the West campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wind came sideways off the Madison Range and made a long, thin sound. Snow traveled with it, a white sheet pulled tight across the pines and the dark seams of rock. Evan Two Rivers kept walking. The bundle in his arms had turned stiff inside its deer-hide wrapping. He held it like a groom carries a bride, not because it helped, but because it was the only way he knew. He saw the smoke first, a single gray thread rising from the edge of the trees. The ribbon wavered in the gusts, and then held. A cabin sat there, low and square its roof, a heavy hump under snow, its window a dull rectangle of yellow. He stopped at the split-rail fence. He did not call out. His breath lifted, faded, lifted again. Inside, a kettle began to sing. May Collins slid the iron off the hot ring and set it to the side. The glass in her only window wore a crack like a white scar. She had stuffed wool in the doorframe, and the wool breathed with the wind. She reached for the shotgun that leaned against the peg by the wall and moved to the window. A figure stood beyond the gate, taller than the posts, black hair iced at the edges. He held something wrapped in hide. He did not shift or stamp his feet. He just took the weather as it came. May set the kettle back, steadying her hands. She unbarred the door. The board rasped in its slot. When she opened the door, the storm put its hands on the latch and tried to rip it away. She stepped into the gap and held the shotgun across her chest. He lifted his eyes. There was nothing wild in them, only hollowed out tired. He looked down at the bundle and then up at her again. "What do you want?" she said. The wind snatched the words and threw them against him. "Just warmth," he said. "Put that on the porch, against the wall, out of the snow." She kept the gun steady, the barrel tracking him. He crossed the small yard with slow steps. He went up 2 creaking boards and knelt. He eased the hide to the boards and brushed snow off the seams with his bare fingers. He pressed his palm to the curve for 1 second, then stood. "Inside," she said. He filled the doorway. Meltwater dripped from his leggings. May shouldered the door closed and set the bar. The sound of wood dropping into place was loud enough to belong to a church bell. She kept the shotgun angled toward him. He did not reach for anything in the room. No chair, no shelf, no cup. He moved to the hearth and sat on the stone ledge, cross-legged hands open to the flames, as if the fire were an altar. May poured black coffee into 2 tin cups. The room smelled of scorched pine-wet wool and black grounds. She brought 1 cup close enough that the steam touched his face. He looked at the tin as if it was a bird that might fly. He took it with both hands. "May," she said, "because names made people stay human." He nodded once. "Evan." He looked at the fire, not at her. Two Rivers. The wind found the chink in the door and made a whistle. May studied his hands. The skin was cracked and raw. The tops of his fingers were a wrong color, flat and waxy. She set the shotgun on the table where she could reach it in 1 step. She pulled a basin, poured warm water, and brought out a small tin of bear grease from a shelf. She laid clean cotton strips beside it. "Hands," she said. His chin dipped. He set the cup down and offered his right palm large and cut and shaking. She took it with both of hers. His skin was winter bark rough against her fingers. When she lowered his hand into the warmth, he hissed and then forced himself quiet. She had him hold the edge of the basin with his other hand. The water ran red at first and then cloudy. "Hold still." She worked with light pressure, lifting grit from the splits. His breath came short. He watched the fire. "Gallatin Crossing," he said. She did not ask a question. She dabbed the purple tips with the pad of the cloth and pressed the grease in with the heel of her thumb. He flinched. "They said she stole flour," he said. "She did not." May wrapped each finger, then the hand not tight enough to turn the cloth gray. Her palm found the notch of his wrist and paused there. The beat under her thumb was slow and strong. She picked up his other hand. She cleaned and wrapped and said nothing of law or blame. Her sleeves were wet to the elbows and smelled of bear fat and smoke. When she finished, he cradled the bandages like he had never seen white cloth before. "Thank you," he said. She wiped her own hands and returned the tin and basin. She put the shotgun back on its peg and set the 2nd cup of coffee on the table for herself. Her eyes drifted to the door. Through the gap at the floor, she saw a faint shadow, a darker stripe in the drift. The bundle lay out there against the wall where she had told him to put it. The room had 1 stool, 1 cot, and a pine table with a split down the middle that someone had pegged together with a dowel. Evan stayed on the hearth. May took the stool, set it back far enough that her knees touched the cot's frame. They did not try to speak. The fire talked for them. It popped and settled, threw up sparks that chased each other into the throat of the chimney. The kettle whistled again, and she lifted it, letting the shriek die. Silence came back fuller than before. Night worked through the seams. The window turned from gray to mirror black. May trimmed the kerosene lamp and then let it burn low. She spread a pallet of furs on the floor by the hearth, hesitated, and then left it there. She pulled her quilt over the cot and lay on her side facing the wall. The shotgun leaned on the floor where her hand could fall on it without looking. She did not sleep. The wind had shifted. It no longer shouted. It sang through the pines in a long, low note. She could hear Evan breathing. After a while, the sound changed. Not a threat, not a step. A small torn thing in the dark like cloth ripping under a coat. He had turned away from the fire and curled himself, but his shoulders trembled. The sound came again, swallowed almost as soon as it was born. May stared at the knots in the pine board above her head. Her mouth tasted like old coffee and fear that had turned to something else. She sat up and swung her feet to the floor. The pallet by the hearth had a second blanket folded at one corner. She took it and laid it over him without touching his arm. The bandages on his hands glowed dull in the red light. He did not look at her. He made himself quiet again. The fire settled and pushed back a little more of the cold. She went back to the cot and lay on her back now. The roof creaked as it shifted its load. Snow thudded somewhere outside, a soft collapse sound. She pictured the hide on the porch with snow sifting around it. She put her hand flat on her chest to keep herself from getting up to stand guard over something she had told him to leave outside. When sleep finally reached her, it was thin and jagged. She fell into it like falling into brush hands up chin-tucked. She woke to hooves stamping and the ring of a bit close to the wall. The knock hit hard and fast against the door. Her body moved before her mind. She sat up with the quilt at her waist and reached the shotgun. Widow Collins, a man called close enough to fog the seam. "You alive in there? Got you a St. Louis catalog." Evan was already awake. He had gone from stillness to a coil in one breath. His eyes found the door and held it. May swallowed and set her feet on the cold floor. The wind pulled at the wool in the jamb, and the latch ticked in its keeper like a nervous tooth. "Coming," she said. She lifted the bar. May opened the door into a face of wind and a beard packed with ice. Rory Pike lounged in the saddle with a sack slung over his pommel and a grin that never reached his eyes. "Took your time, Widow Collins?" He lifted the sack. "St. Louis catalog, ladies' fashions, tinware nonsense you can dream over." May stepped into the gap and kept her body between him and the room. The wool in the jamb fluttered. Heat rolled out past her and met the cold with a hiss. "Appreciate it, Rory." He leaned, peering past her shoulder. He had a way of looking that felt like a hand in a pocket that was not his. His gaze snagged on the hearth, on the pallet of furs, on the 2 cups on the man seated cross-legged in the red glow. "You hire on help in a storm, do you?" He clicked his tongue. Evan did not move. The bandages on his hands were clean and white. He held his cup with care like it might burn through and spill. May felt her throat go dry. Her fingers tightened on the door. "Hired for the woodpile," she said. "Storm was too much for just me." Rory's grin widened, small, mean pleasure brightening his eyes. Well now, a Christian kindness that. He held out the catalog. The paper was thick edges, stamped with a blot of green ink from the post. He let it drop into her hands. "You be careful. Word likes to walk in weather like this." He tapped his hat and turned his mare. Snow creaked under the horse. Hooves faded into the trees. May shut the door and dropped the bar. The sound landed hard. The room was warm. It did not feel like it. She set the catalog on the table with its green stamp staring up and stood there with her palm flat on the paper. "I did not mean that," she said. Evan watched the fire. He lifted the cup and drank at last. The muscles in his jaw tightened and eased, tightened and eased. He said nothing. The wind fell to a tired rush. Light shifted. The day wore itself thin against the panes. May kept the pot turning and the fire fed. She pretended not to watch him. When she brought a bowl of stew and a heel of bread, he accepted both and ate in slow, even bites. He finished and set the spoon down without a scrape. "Thank you," he said. When she woke to the certainty of absence, there was no sound, no breath by the hearth, no shift of cloth. She sat up. The pallet lay smooth on one side where he had slept and flat where he had risen. The door had been unbarred and barred again. Cold pinched at her toes when she crossed to the window. The porch boards carried a pattern of wet and snow. May pulled on boots and shrugged into her coat. She took the shotgun and stepped into the white light that rises when a storm has not ended but decided to hold steady. The cold took her breath and handed it back in shards. She followed the long prints along the fence across the yard, past the coop, through scrub oak, into the thin stand of trees at the edge of her land. He stood there with his back to her shoulders, square head bowed. At his feet, a cairn rose rocks pried from frozen ground and cleared of snow, stacked with neat hands. The deer-hide bundle was not there. It had a place now. The stones held that place like a body holds a heartbeat. May stopped short of him. The snow hissed under her weight. "Coffee is on," she said. He looked over his shoulder. His eyes were old and clear. He nodded and turned back to the pile. He put his palm on the top stone and held it one breath too. Then he came with her. The day deepened and narrowed. They moved around each other in a new silence, careful and spare. Evan brought in wood without being asked. He stepped out to the porch for a round of pine and came back with white dust in his hair. May mended a split in the table with a wedge and mallet and ground more coffee than she needed. Her hands remembered his hands. She heated water and changed the dressings. He held still eyes on the glow behind the grate. "You finished that wrap neat," he said, looking at the way she tied the cloth. "You split wood neat," she said. He had a small smile for that. It was there and gone. Night pressed up to the glass again. The cold bit sharper after the wind had tired. May drew the pallet closer to the hearth and shook out a second blanket. The air in the room had a weight to it that was not fear. She set the shotgun within reach, then knelt to roll the edge of the fur to make a pillow. "Closer," she said, for warmth. Evan hesitated. He did not look at her. He pulled his blanket, then lay on his back on the pallet with his bandaged hands folded on his chest. The fire printed copper light on his skin. May lay down beside him, a careful space between them. They listened to the pop and sigh of the wood and the tick of cooling iron. She turned on her side and found him watching the ceiling beams. His mouth moved and stopped. He turned his face toward her. The shape of his grief was still there, only shifted less a knife and more a stone. "May," he said, as if testing the name. "Evan," she said. He leaned in not far, only enough that she could smell smoke on him and the bitter of coffee. His mouth touched hers and waited. It was not a taking, it was an answer. She breathed and answered back. The kiss was small and certain. Heat traveled like a line of sun under a door. When it ended, they were not touching. The space felt different. They slept, the kind of sleep that is not heavy, only truce. The morning broke thin and bright. Snow lay hard. Light made the room clean and cold, even with the fire dressed high. May was at the stove when she heard the jangle of tack and the crunch of a horse in the yard. She froze. Her hand hovered over the kettle. Rory Pike rapped with two knuckles in a kind of cheer that held no warmth. "Widow Collins, you said on breakfast for two today." May set the pot aside and wiped her hands on her skirt. She met Evan's eyes for a heartbeat. He stood by the hearth, already stepping back from it, shoulders gathering themselves like cloth pulled tight. She lifted the bar and let in cold air and Rory's smile. "Morning," she said. He leaned into the doorway without asking. He took in the room. His glance snagged on the pallet on the tangle where two blankets had been turned and turned again. His eyes slid to Evan and back to May. His voice dropped as if sharing a small, sweet secret. "I see how it is." May felt heat rising into her face. Words came, and she caught them and made them into something else. "He has hired help," she said. "Got caught in the blow. I put him to work." Rory laughed sharp and short. "A fine thing." He spat brown into the snow and left the print of his boot beside it. "You watch yourself. Folks get their tongues hung up when they get bored." He touched his hat brim and rode off with his laughter small behind him. The silence he left was worse than any wind. May closed the door. The bar slid home. She did not turn. She knew before she looked that Evan was pulling on his hide shirt, that his hands were careful not to catch the bandage, that his face had gone to stone the way a river face freezes in a night. "Evan," she said. He stepped past the table without looking at her. He was tall enough that he had to bow his head under the low rafters. He paused at the door and set his palm on the bar as if to feel the weight of it, then lifted. Cold came in. He went out. The door stood open. May chased him through it. "Wait." She did not think to take boots. The porch boards bit. She slid and caught herself on the post and then stumbled into the yard. The snow crust cut clean lines into her stockings. He was already past the fence, moving toward the trees. He did not turn. "Evan?" Her breath wrote itself in white that ripped and vanished. She took another step and another. Heat and cold tangled in her legs. The pain came late, sharp and bright. She looked down and saw a small red flare on the surface of the snow, then another neat as berries. Something cracked in the distance, not the roof settling, not a tree shedding ice. A single hard sound from the direction of Gallatin Crossing that reached the canyon edge thin as wire and pulled at the air. The sound from the direction of Gallatin Crossing thinned and died. May stood in the yard with blood pricking through her stockings and watched the line of trees take Evan in. Snow carried light on its back. The air held a quiet that did not promise anything. He went until he could not hear the cabin, then farther. He kept to the cut of the ridge and the dark of the pines. By dusk, he found the ravine where winter had pulled men and women and 2 small boys into a camp of canvas and scrap. No one asked him questions. They saw the set of his jaw and the bandages on his hands, and they made a space. He slept with his back to a dead log and woke at every shift in the wind. Dawn came as a skin of pale on the snow. Torches showed before the men who carried them. Horses pushed breath into the cold. The first shot cracked and tore bark from a sapling above his head. Evan rolled and came up with his knife because there was nothing else to come up with. A second shot lifted his shoulder and burned through. He staggered and kept his feet. Men rode down the long slope as if it were a road. One leaned from the saddle and reached for a girl who ran toward the creek. Evan went at the horse and caught the rider by the belt and pulled him out of the saddle. They hit hard. The man's knife found Evan's side and went in under the ribs and out again. Evan's hand found the rider's throat and closed and did not open until the fight went out of him. The girl ran. The creek sounded like iron tearing. Guns spoke, and then the ravine held only smoke and a few small cries and the sound of canvas catching. Evan walked into the creek and let the water take his legs. Cold kept his blood where it should be. He stayed in the thicket until light moved, and then moved himself 1 foot then the other over the low shoulder of the ridge toward the only place he knew. He reached the piles of oak and the fence and the line of the porch as the sun was turning thin. He did not go to the door. He went to the stand of scrub where the cairn stood. He slid down the trunk of a small tree and set his hand on the top stone. Breath lifted from him in a weak string. "I am tired," he said, mouth barely open. A figure came up out of the white. May carried the shotgun with the barrel low. Mud and snow had soaked the hem of her skirt. Her hair was pulled hard off her face and pinned and already coming loose. "Get up," she said. He looked at her hands. They held steady. He looked at the barrel, then at her eyes. "I am dying," he said. "Not today." She set the gun in the snow and knelt. She tore a strip from her petticoat with 3 sharp pulls. She pressed it into his side and leaned her weight in. He made a sound and bit it off. Steam rose off their breath and the wound. "Hold," she said. She tied the cloth and tied it again until it held. She got under his arm and made him stand when he did not want to. She was smaller than the tree he had been leaning on, and still she moved him. They went behind the hill to the root cellar, and she pushed the doors with her shoulder, and the boards swung open. She took him down 1 step at a time into the dark where potatoes lay in old burlap, and the dirt walls kept the cold honest. She piled furs on him and put the shotgun within reach and took his face in her hands for 1 second, and then went. May ran the slope and took the road that ran flat between pines and snow to Coal Bend. The town was a belt of plank fronts and false faces, and a wide street with ruts frozen hard. The sheriff's office sat with its single window and its stovepipe that failed to pull smoke straight. Sheriff Boone had his boots on the desk and a newspaper folded across his lap. He looked at May as if she were a draft that had slipped in. "They rode on the ravine," she said. "They killed people. He is hurt. You need to stop what is coming." Boone scratched his cheek with 1 fingernail and let his gaze drop back to the print. "You bring an Indian out here," he said, "and trouble comes along behind like a hungry dog." "He is a man with a name," she said. "I got more men with names than chairs," he said. He set the paper aside without folding it and studied her face. "You should go home." She stood there, and the heat in her rose, and did not find a place to go. She turned and left and crossed the street and went to the assayer's office where a lamp made the window look like a small pond at dusk. Mr. Ellsworth had a clerk's hands, narrow and quick. He looked up with a smile he had practiced for years. "We are closed, Mrs. Collins." She shut the door behind her and stepped to the counter. She put both hands on the wood and leaned in until the lamp lit her knuckles. "I need a telegraph from the marshal in Prescott," she said, dismissing charges. "Clearing a man named Evan. It needs a stamp." Ellsworth laughed once. It was a sound that had no pride in it. "That is not how paper works." "Bluebird House," she said. "Red hair, 2nd room on the alley. Tuesdays, Fridays. Your wife wears a silver cross and keeps the key to your desk in her apron." The laugh died. He went gray and then flushed and forgot to hide the way his jaw trembled. He stared at her hands as if they might crawl over the counter. "You would not do that," he said. "He is in a cellar bleeding," she said. "They will hang him for existing. I need the paper." He opened a drawer and drew out a pad with the marshal's letterhead arranged like teeth along the top edge. He bent and wrote with care. He stamped the bottom with a blue that spread into the fibers and left its chemical smell on the air. He sanded the wet place and blew on it and slid it across. "Will they believe it?" he said. "They will see what they want," she said, and left before his hand stopped shaking. Men had gathered outside the saloon. The Lucky Bottle's doors swung and let out light and heat and a smell of whiskey and onions. Abel Crane stood with his hat low and his eyes up. Micah's face was new raw with a teenage beard. A group of miners crowded the steps. Some had ropes draped over their shoulders like new tools. "There she is," Micah called. "That widow. She is the one keeping a breed." May did not back away. She stepped up onto the boardwalk with the paper in her left hand and her right reaching blind for a handle next to the door. Her fingers found the iron of a pot and heat climbed into her palm. A cook swore from the kitchen. Micah took one step for her and one arm reached to pull the paper. May threw the pot and the boiling stew went into his face and down his shirt collar, and he screamed high and awful and dropped to his knees. The crowd lurched back. She did not run. She turned and faced Sheriff Boone, who had followed the noise and now stood in the street with his thumbs in his belt. "Read this," she said loud enough for the porch and the street and the second-floor window where curtains shifted. She held the blue stamp high. The paper looked official because it was paper, and it had ink and government words. Boone squinted and stepped up and did not take it. He read enough with his eyes and then lifted his head to the men and spat once and said, "You boys go on home. Marshall says what he says. I'm not arguing with a stamp." A murmur ran through the line and then broke apart. Men did not like to step away from heat once they had felt it. They went anyway because the excuse was right there in blue. Micah made a sound like a burned tea kettle and Abel pulled him to his feet. May walked. She did not hurry. She kept the paper in her hand and let heads turn to follow it. She reached the edge of town and the road opened thin between the trees. She stepped off the boards and onto rutted snow, and only then let herself breathe. She made it back as light fell away. The hill behind the cabin held its old cold. She opened the cellar and found Evan's eyes on the dark, like an animal's, alive and patient. She showed him the paper and put it aside and lifted him and took his weight again. He grunted and caught it in his teeth. She got him to the pallet near the hearth and set him there and fed the stove until iron glowed. He looked at her bandaged hands and then at her face. He reached for her wrist with clumsy fingers and did not find it. "What did you do?" he asked. "What I had," she said. She rinsed blood from the cloth and hung it over the chair back. She put the paper in the drawer under the table and closed it and put a cup over the drawer as if that would keep anything safe. Evan slept hard and woke and slept again. May sat and kept the fire honest and let the room hold quiet. The night stretched and then released. By noon the next day, the yard had prints she did not make. Hooves more than one horse. Men rode up the track and stopped and filled the view from the window with coats and hats. Abel Crane pulled his horse around by the bit and looked at her porch as if it had been built to irk him. Micah sat hunched, skin blistered, and tight eyes burning with the kind of hate that does not need sense. May opened the door and stood with the shotgun held at her thigh. The wind was still. Smoke from the chimney went straight up. "You harbor a killer," Abel said. "I harbor a man," she said. She held up the paper. The stamp caught light. The blue went bright, then dull. The men leaned without meaning to. Sheriff Boone sat his horse at the edge of them, with his hat tipped board as a man at a long sermon. "The marshal says charges are dismissed," Boone said. "You want to argue ride to Prescott and sweat on his porch." Abel looked from the sheriff to the paper to May's face. He made a small, disgusted sound and set his mouth. He pulled his reins and turned his horse. Micah did not turn. He stared at May as if he could set her on fire with it. "Bring the marshal," he said, "to no one and to everyone. Bring soldiers. We will hunt them to the last tree." He wheeled at last and followed the others, his horse blowing steam like a forge. Smoke rose clean from May's chimney. Her fingers uncurled from the stock one by one. The door took the bar and settled. The bar settled and stayed. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, a slender mark on the white day. Evan slept and woke and slept again. May kept the stove fed and the dressings clean. The blue stamp lay under the table in a drawer under a cup. By evening his fever had thinned. He sat up with care and said her name as if measuring how much it would cost to speak. She set a cup in his hands. His fingers were clumsy around the tin, but they held. "We cannot keep this fire," she said. Too many eyes like smoke. He nodded once. He tried to stand and failed, then stood the second time. They did not gather keepsakes. They wrapped bread and salt pork and the small tin of salve and one change of linen. May took a hen from the coop and tied its legs with a rag. She looked at the door and ran her palm over the wood, over the groove where the bar had worn it smooth. They left at night. The yard held its own light under the snow. Their breaths made brief ghosts. May took his weight under one arm and the shotgun under the other. He took what he could carry without bending. They went past the fence and into the timber where wind spoke low. They kept to ridge lines and shallow draws. The moon wore a thin rim and the snow gave back what little it had. Some nights they found a cut of rock that broke the wind. Some nights they did not. May built fires no larger than a hat. She cupped her hands around them and watched the smoke until it went straight and thin, and then she killed it with snow. Evan walked until his side sang a hard note and then breathed until it fell away. When he slept like a stone dropped into a creek, deep and sudden. May watched until her own eyes closed without permission. On the fourth morning, a notch opened in the line of cliffs. A creek slid between dark rocks and pulled a clear path north. The banks drew tight and then let go. They stepped out into a bowl of land that held its own weather. Pines ringed the edges like a wall. Aspen stood in a bright band along the water. The ground under the snow had a darker look, richer, softer. Elk had passed through and left tracks that crossed and braided and uncrossed again. Evan put the satchel down and looked as if the air itself hurt. May took one step into the flat and listened. The place had a sound, a soft running, instead of the high scrape they had been living in. She pulled her scarf down and breathed until her lungs understood. "Here," she said. He answered without words. He touched her shoulder, then walked to the creek and knelt and put both hands into it until the cold stole feeling and left quiet. They worked in the way work teaches a body to be calm. Evan chose a pine with a straight trunk and a crown that would give without breaking the world around it. He set the bite of the axe and widened the cut clean and patient. He did not let the tree tear itself loose. He coaxed it down with wedges and blade until it came to earth with a measured fall. He trimmed and measured and cut and dragged. He notched ends with his knife and laid walls that caught and held. May found the ground that did not puddle. She scraped back the crust and put her hands into black soil and felt the way it took a shape and kept it. She found stones in the creek that were round and heavy and set them in a U against the wall. She brought wet clay in a bucket and pressed it into the seams until her fingers were raw and the seams held like they were born that way. Days made a string. He lifted and fit. She cooked and mended. He set rafters and laid a roof of poles and brush and packed earth. She hung a small bundle of dried sage from a peg because the smell calmed her. At night, they lay on a pallet where the wall met the new hearth. The fire told them what the air wanted to do, and they listened. Evan's hands toughened. The bandages came off and his skin found its own color again. May's hands cracked and mended and cracked again. She learned his footsteps when he came back from the timber. He learned the way her breath changed when a stew had cooked as long as it could. He snared rabbits in a run of brush and brought down a young buck on the second try. He carried it on his shoulders and bled it beside the creek with a clean stroke. She plucked feathers from the hen and set meat to smoke on a small scaffold, a thin ribbon rising past her face. Spring moved under the snow. It spoke first in the sound of dripping from the roof and the way light tilted at evening. The creek ran louder, and cold water licked at the edges of ice with a new edge. May felt tired and told herself it was the climb, the thin air, the work. She was washing shirts at the flat rock by the bend when pain caught her. It was not sharp at first. It wrapped and held and then dug in. She put her hand on the rock and did not breathe for a count. The next wave took her from her knees. She saw the sky, and then saw her hands, and then saw red in the water sliding away from her like a ribbon that did not want to stay. Evan was halfway back from the tree line. He heard her voice tear its own name. He dropped the axe and ran, and the world moved slower than his legs. He slid on the bank and caught her. She was light and hard in his arms. He carried her to the cabin and laid her on the pallet and said her name until he could say it quiet. The hours after that had a color. It was the gray of wood ash when the heat has gone, but the shape remains. May bit a strip of cloth and worked through the waves. She cried without sound because sound was too much. Evan brought water and wrung cloths and put his hands where pain asked for them. The blood had its own pace. The room smelled of iron and smoke and sage. When it ended, there was a small silence that felt like the world had leaned in and listened and then straightened without speaking. Evan took the soaked rags and the small, terrible evidence and walked under the pines at the far edge of the basin. He dug with a flat rock until his hands bled again. He buried what should have been named. He stood there and watched his breath and did not put his hands together or say anything to the air. He came back and sat with his back to the hearth he had built and stared at his hands. May lay on her side and watched the split in the table where the wedge held it true. The fire had taken on a steady tone. It did not need tending for a time. Evan lifted his eyes and then lowered them. "What I love I ruin," he said. May pushed herself up. Her face was salt and pale. The quilt slid to her waist. She stood very slowly. Her legs shook, but they held. She came to him and stood over him and set her hand on the mantel to keep from falling. "Do not make this a rule because it is easy," she said. "Do not name this the way of things and hand it to me like a plate I did not ask for." He looked at the floor as if it might answer him. The muscles in his neck jumped. His hand swept out. The shelf took it and gave up a skillet and 2 cups. They struck the packed dirt and bounced and rang. The sound filled the small house and hung there. "They murdered her," he said, each word pulled up from a place that did not heal. "I brought death here. It knows my trail." "I am not," Lena May said. Her hands curled and uncurled. Her throat worked. "I am here. I am breathing. I am bleeding. Look at me." He flinched as if she had struck him. He stood too fast and the room bent. He went to the door and opened it and stepped out into air that still held winter even with the sun high. May counted to 10 and then walked to the threshold and stood in it. The cold came around her ankles and climbed. He stood by the creek where the pain had taken her down. The water made its quick, hard music. He did not turn when she came to 10 feet behind him. "If you walk," she said, "you do not walk to the fence. You walk past where feet can find each other again." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh and not a laugh at all. He turned slowly, and the face he showed her was not stone. It was a thing made of grief and fear and stubborn love and the terror that comes with it. "If I give you all and the world takes you," he said, "I will be dust." She put her hand flat against her chest. Her heart worked, and she let it show in the line of her neck. "I am here," she said. He closed the space as if he had decided against it, and then could not help himself. He did not pick her up. He leaned into her. His forehead found the place between her shoulder and her throat. His hands found her back and held on like a man who had fallen and found a branch. His weight came, and she set her feet and took it. He shook. He did not make himself quiet. The sound he made was smaller than the room and bigger than the hills. She slid her fingers into his hair. She said his name the way one says water to a thirsty thing. His breath ran warm at her skin and then let itself be steady. He lifted his head and looked at her and put both hands on her face. His thumbs found the paths her tears had made and wiped them away, though new ones came. "You are not my past," he said. She kissed him. It was not a soft thing. It had steadiness in it. It told the room a different story than the one the skillet had told. He answered with his whole mouth and then gentled. The ground under them was damp with thaw. They went back inside and set the door until the latch caught. They lay on the pallet with the fire finding its breath again. They touched in the way people do when there is nothing left to explain, only things to say without words. It was slow and clean. It was a promise made without paper. Night came and set black against the window. The basin held quiet. The fire dropped to a long red and then woke and then dropped again. May slept with her hand on his chest and felt the engine of him work. Evan watched the rafters and felt the weight in his ribs go loose. He rose and stirred the coals and added one split and watched the smoke take the straight way up the throat of the chimney. He stepped to the door and eased it open enough to see sky. A pinprick of orange glowed on a far shoulder of rock and went out. He closed the door and set the bar and listened to the old wood take the weight. Morning came cold and blue. Frost had climbed the inside of the window in thin ferns. Evan moved with care, set a split on the coals, and watched smoke take the straight path up the throat of the chimney. May stirred on the pallet and reached across the blanket until her hand found his side. He covered her fingers and held them there. Spring thickened. Water ran fuller in the creek and pushed stones so they clicked against one another like teeth. Aspen leafed and showed their silver undersides in every wind. The roof held against a week of rain. Clay in the seams dried hard and pale as bone. Rabbits learned their routes around the small garden. Elk passed at dusk and left the smell of wet hide and trampled sage. Summer pressed in with light that did not want to end. They worked with the sun and sometimes past it. Evan lifted rounds and set rafters and packed earth with the flat of his shovel. May set beans and corn and squash in 3 mounds and watched the soil take them. Her hands were lined with new cuts and old ones turning pink. She slept hard and woke heavier than before. The afternoon she went to the creek for shirts the sky had a gloss to it that meant heat would hold. The water was ankle deep and quick. She bent and soaped a cuff, and the first grip of pain took her breath. She set a hand on the rock and held herself still. The next took her to her knees. Evan came to her before the third wave. He carried her in and made the room right. He set water to warm and tore linen and washed his knife until it shone. He spoke in short words and a low voice. She breathed when the pain let her and bore down when it told her to. Hours passed and the light turned through each color it had. Smoke built and thinned and built again. The stove ticked. Her fingers curled into his and he leaned into that grip and did not pull away. The child came with a long cry and a mouth wide open for air. Evan cut the cord and washed her in a wooden bowl with water he had tested with his wrist. His hands were the same hands that had split rails and carried deer and tied knots in storms. They were careful enough now to move a soft head and a small shoulder without leaving a mark. He wrapped the girl in deer hide and put her on May's chest. May laughed once and then let tears go where they wanted. "She is strong," May said, voice frayed and bright at once. Evan watched the child search and find. He had the look of a man facing down light he could not hold with his eyes. "Her name," May said, and looked at him. He looked back. For a second, the room held the weight of every name it could hold. The fire dropped and then caught and threw a warm bar across the floor. "Lena," he said. May did not flinch. She touched the small jaw with one finger. "We remember by living," he said. May nodded. The girl lay with one fist pressed to her own cheek as if already bracing herself for weather. Evan bent and kissed the dark hair. He tasted the smoke and the salt on her head and stood very still. They slept in pieces and woke to feed and sleep again. Days found a new shape and held to it. Evan stitched a cradle board and lined it with soft moss. He hung it from a peg where the draft could not touch it. May moved slower for a time and then found her pace again. She tied the willow ring around her own finger with a fresh strip of wool because the old one had frayed smooth. Evan smiled at the knot and shook his head as if amazed at how a thing could be mended with almost nothing. Summer broke into a fall that came clean and quick. Frost returned and stayed in the low places. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line that straightened out as soon as it reached air that kept its word. Lena learned to sleep through the kettle's whistle and the crack of splitting. She learned to roll toward the sound of May's voice. Evan learned how to make a stew that did not stick to the bottom and how to read the sky for a shift that mattered. The year turned. Aspen dropped coin after coin until the ground shone. Snow came quiet and even. They cut wood until the pile stood higher than the fence. They lived with a clock that sat in the stars and in the mouth of the creek and in the slow swell of the child at May's breast. Another summer, and Lena pulled herself up on the chair leg and threw herself into steps that were not yet walking and not crawling either. She found the chickens and laughed when they scattered. She found the water and slapped it flat with both hands. Evan scooped her up and she squealed at the sudden air. He kissed her feet and she kicked his jaw and he laughed into the kicking. May hung strings of herbs under the eaves. Their smell trailed through the doorway whenever the draft blew right. She rubbed tallow into the wood of the table until the split with the wedge looked like a decision rather than a scar. The blue stamp lay in a small wooden box on a shelf. She had wrapped it in a scrap of cloth with 2 stitches. Some days she forgot it for hours. Horses came up from the trees one bright afternoon when the air had the round sound of late summer. 3 men and a wagon. The wagon carried plows and chairs and a trunk. A woman sat on the plank seat with a child wrapped by her side. The lead rider raised his hat as he approached the porch and stopped at a distance that said he knew what a gun could do from that range. "Ma'am," he said. His voice had dust on it. "We do not mean harm. Thomas Hale. This is my brother and my boy." He touched the brim again toward the wagon. "My wife Annie." May stood in the doorway with the shotgun against her thigh. The sun on the barrel made a hard line. The chimney puffed a clean ribbon into the sky. "This basin is taken," she said. Hale nodded. "We figured it might be." He had a way of looking straight that did not feel like a search. "We came out of Coal Bend. Heard of a woman who walked a man through a street full of ropes with nothing but paper and her own voice. Heard you 2 went high and did not come back down." May did not answer. The woman on the wagon lifted a hand in a small wave that looked like a question asked polite. Hale looked at the trees and the lay of the creek and the open ground. "We can move on up the water." He jerked his chin toward the cut where the creek climbed into darker timber. "Plenty of room if folks mind their fences. We do our own work." We pay our own hunger. We do not call the sheriff when a man builds a fire. Evan came out of the trees with a deer on his shoulders. He set it down clean on the grass and wiped his hands on moss he pulled from his pocket. He took in the horses and the wagon and the child peeking around her mother's arm. He set his knife on the porch rail where everyone could see it. He stood by May without touching her, and the line of their bodies made a wall that did not need raising. Hale tipped his head to Evan the way men do when they have met each other before the meeting. "Sir." Evan nodded. He looked at May, and May took in the wagon and the way the woman's eyes held hope like water in a cup that could spill if a voice came too loud. "Up the creek," May said. Hale breathed a sound you could hear only because the air kept still. "Thank you. We keep quiet. We keep to our work." He put his hat back on and clicked to the team. The wagon wheels bumped over grass and found the old elk trail. The woman looked back and raised her fingers once more. May lifted her hand and returned it. The boy on the second horse rode past with his boots too big for his stirrups. He tried not to stare and failed in a way that had no harm in it. They went under the aspen and were gone in the band of bright leaves. Evan carried the deer to the rack and set to the work of dressing it. The knife moved with tidy cuts. Lena came out onto the porch and looked at the place where the wagon had been and stamped her foot at the dust as if ordering it to settle. May picked her up and set her on her hip. The child leaned her head under May's chin and hummed at nothing. The afternoon settled on the porch and found both of them there. Evan sat on the step with his back to the post and his knees out. May sat with the child and put her bare feet on the warm board. Smoke rose straight. The door stood open, the bar hooked up on its peg. The willow ring on May's finger had gone smooth where the wool wrapped it. Evan reached and set his hand lightly over her hand and Lena's foot. The creek kept talking. A jay railed from the far trees and then thought better of it and fell quiet. Somewhere up the water a hammer knocked once, twice, 3 times, and then paused. Lena laughed. The sound went into the blue and did not thin. The cabin held it and gave it back. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.